Good day. Over the last couple of videos, I have been discussing extensively the fact that this August was supposed to be the month of the great Ukrainian counteroffensive towards Kherson, a counteroffensive which has not, by the way, materialized. Over the last few hours, we've now had reports that Ukraine is indeed preparing a counteroffensive, only this time it's not towards Kherson, it's in a completely different place. It is in Kharkiv region, right at the other end of Ukraine, and it is supposed to be directed at attacking the Russian forces concentrated in and around the town of ETHEREUM, attacking these Russian forces in their flank, even as those Russian forces press south towards Slavyansk. Well, on its face, this proposed counterattack or counteroffensive, which supposedly or allegedly has been suggested to President Zelensky by the chief of Ukraine's general staff, General Zaluzhny. Well, on its face, this proposed counteroffensive, might have more realistic possible chances than the counteroffensive towards Kherson. Now, the fundamental problem with the Kherson counteroffensive, well, there were many problems, but one of the problems was that it would have required an advance of Ukrainian infantry across open plains, the South Ukrainian steppe land, where they would have been very visible to Russian artillery, missile strikes, aircraft, helicopter gunships, whatever. It would been very difficult to imagine the Ukrainian force, a largely infantry force by now, succeeding in marching all the way down to Kherson city in the face of this overwhelming firepower that the Russians would have been able to deploy in this area. By contrast, the area around ETHEREUM is different. It is much more heavily forested. There's a network of small rivers, of which the most important is, of course, the Seversky Donetsk. So a Ukrainian attacking force might be able to rely on some cover in order to be able to push forward its advance. However, it's important to say that Ukraine has repeatedly tried to launch counterattacks against the Russian force in ETHEREUM in precisely this area. There have been, I've lost count of how many attempts Ukraine has actually made to try and launch counterattacks in this precise area. And every single one of these counterattacks has failed. Every single one. They've all been thrown back across the Seversky Donetsk River, usually with heavy losses. Now, I don't know what has changed to make a new counterattack in this area successful, but on the strength of previous history, recent history, it doesn't seem likely that such a counterattack would in fact be successful. I wonder whether this story of a counterattack in the ETHEREUM area is simply another attempt by Ukraine and by its Western backers. I note that the British Ministry of Defence is now also talking up speculations, as it calls them, of a Ukrainian counterattack. I wonder whether all this renewed talk of a Ukrainian counterattack, this time in ETHEREUM region, is part of the constant game we've been hearing for some time to try to get to keep morale high in Ukraine and in the West by promising us some great Ukrainian counterattack or counteroffensive somewhere, which, however, never quite materializes. Well, we shall see. In the meantime, the British Ministry of Defence reports an intensification of fighting in Donbass. I think that's almost certainly true, though we lack details. But there are reports, difficult to confirm, that after intense shelling, Ukrainian forces which were defending a place called Nova Mikhailovka have been forced to retreat, that the Russians may be in the process of occupying this village, which is important apparently in cutting off Marinka. There's also reports which look much more reliable than these reports about a counterattack, by the way. There's also reports that Ukrainian intelligence has informed the Ukrainian High Command and the Ukrainian government that Avdiivka, the most important fortified area that Ukraine possesses opposite Donetsk city, is likely to be completely surrounded within the next 3 weeks. We don't know definitely that that is the case, but if that is indeed the case, then it's highly likely, to borrow a phrase much loved by the British government, by the way, it is highly likely that we will see the final collapse of Ukrainian defences opposite Donetsk city. Whilst I'm on this topic, by the way, I noticed that the British Ministry of Defence reports that the Donbass militia, the Donetsk militia, has now battled its way to the centre of Pesky. Now that is a bit strange because virtually everybody reporting on this war, both from the Russian and the Ukrainian side, has been saying that Pesky has been fully captured by the Russians for at least a week. But anyway, I'm not going to dwell on these strange inconsistencies. We are getting other reports from other places. We're getting reports that Ukraine has suffered heavy losses in the area northwest of Kharkiv city, that Ukrainian reinforcements that were sent there have suffered heavy losses, and that the Russians have been continuing to push south in that offensive, about which we are extremely poorly informed. And there is a huge amount of internet chatter about further Russian advances towards Nikolaev, of the Russians taking steps to surround Nikolaev, encircle Nikolaev, this important port city in southwest Ukraine on the southern Bug River. I can't obviously confirm this, it's plausible, but who knows what the truth is. And in Donbass itself, we are getting all kinds of information about very heavy Ukrainian losses, very heavy Russian artillery fire. And yesterday, in its latest report, the Military Summary Channel suggested that for the moment, the Russians are just content to go on shelling, because the Ukrainians, in trying to hold this undefendable line, the Zelensky line, from Siversk in the north all the way to the Bakhmut in the south, are being forced to send in reinforcements to hold particular locations. These reinforcements are then massively shelled by the Russian artillery, causing Ukraine to suffer enormous losses. The troops are then pulled back, other fresh troops are put in their place. The whole cycle repeats itself until eventually the positions become undefendable, the losses become unsustainable, and Ukraine is then forced to pull back from these defended positions. That's the view that the Military Summary Channel has. I have to say, I'm a little bit more skeptical about this. It seems to me that we've been in this kind of situation many times. I remember way back in the spring and early summer, at the time of the Battle of Mariupol, for example, there were lots of comments and talk about how the fighting in the Donbass was at a standstill. how the Russians were failing to make progress in Mariupol. The Ministry of Defense reports, as I remember from that time from Britain, telling us about how the Russians were only making minimal gains. And this narrative persisted up to the moment when Mariupol eventually fell and the Ukrainian defenders of the Azovstal steel factory surrendered, engaged in a mass surrender. And we had the similar story, exactly the same narrative during the fighting in Lugansk region as the Severodonetsk Lysychansk conurbation was being cleared. And we're hearing the same narrative again. And the reality, I suspect, is that there's a lot of change on the battlefields. Undoubtedly, Russian artillery is extremely active. Russian missile attacks are extremely active. But there's a lot of activity on the battlefields. One hears, for example, other reports that the Russians are gradually advancing, clearing Ukrainian defenses on the Donetsk Ring Road. We don't know very much about this, but a lot of things like that are probably going on, which we're simply not very informed about. This is, after all, a war, and it's understandable that both sides want to withhold information about events that are taking place on the ground. So I would say that, though I think the military summary channel is probably on to something, that it is indeed the case that the Russians are sometimes content simply to shell Ukrainian troops who put themselves in undefendable, unsustainable positions until those troops are broken in spirit and forced to flee or retreat. But we mustn't assume that that's the whole story of the fighting in Donbass. By the way, I would add, in support of what the military summary channel has said, that Marinus, that US Marine officer who wrote that piece in the Marine Corps Journal discussing the fighting in Ukraine, he made a rather similar point. He said that there have been instances in the fighting in Donbass when the Russians have actually retreated from some positions, luring the Ukrainians to occupy those positions so as to make it easier for the Russians to then inflict massive losses on the Ukrainians, who are lured onto open ground where they can be massively shelled by the overwhelming power of Russia's artillery. So I'm going to say that, I think that the military summary channel almost certainly is onto something, but I think that the reality, the actual granular reality from on the ground, is rather more complex than that report implies. I strongly suspect that the Russians are still pushing forward in places like Adema and Soledar. They're gradually working with their artillery to soften up the defences there, but I suspect that they will indeed launch storming operations to clear those places, to complete the encirclement of places like Avdiivka and Bakhmut, and that this will indeed be achieved, as that intelligence report that has allegedly been provided to the Ukrainian leadership with respect to Avdiivka, as that suggests. By the way, there are also reports that the Russians are also working towards surrounding the town of Ugledar in southern Donetsk. Incidentally, if all of this is true, if there are these Russian encirclement operations indeed underway, then the Russians may be working towards encircling 4 different locations at one and the same time. Nikolaev in the southwest, Ugledar in the south of Donetsk region, Avdiivka further north, opposite Donetsk city, and Bakhmut city in terms of the Donbass, perhaps the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, further north from Avdiivka as well. Well, perhaps Russian operations are not quite as ambitious as that. Perhaps they're not really trying to encircle all of these places simultaneously, but who knows? And I remain of the view, by the way, that there is indeed a major Russian build-up underway, that we've had scattered reports about this from various places. It seems to me that these advances towards Ugledar and northwest of Kharkiv, and the advance towards Nikolaev all point to some big event in preparation. We'll just have to wait and see what it is, but let me repeat again, the Russians are working to their own timetable and they're not sharing their plans with anyone. Now, whilst I'm talking about plans and operations and reports, I do want to give credit to one of the many people who write to me in emails about the events in the battlefields. This is somebody who has a military background in the United States military, and this person has previously given me some very valuable information about the HIMARS missiles and their missile strikes on the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson region, about which more shortly. But this person has also been discussing the drone attacks in Crimea. And this person pointed out that the attack on the airbase in Saki in Crimea, the one that caused by far the biggest damage, the ammunition explosions, the fire there, the damage, the confirmed damage to several aircraft at Saki airport. This person pointed out that the pattern of the explosions and the fire is consistent with mortar rounds being used against some of these ammunition dumps, except that he thought it unlikely that actual ground mortars had been deployed, and he did some investigating, and he speculated that mortar rounds or perhaps grenades had been dropped on the Saki airfield by special drones. And he then did some further research, and he found that Taiwan actually has developed drones which do have some kind of revolver mechanism. These are small drones with a kind of revolver mechanism which can be used to drop grenades or could be adapted to drop mortar rounds. And his speculation was that Taiwan might have supplied some of these drones to the Ukrainian military, and the Ukrainian military might have used them in the attack on Saki airfield and elsewhere in Crimea. Well, just a day ago, I saw a report on the RT website saying that Taiwan has indeed supplied Ukraine with 800 of these drones. So I'm not sure whether it really is 800 drones, but perhaps it is, in which case it seems to me that this settles the issue. This person, his deductions were absolutely correct. It was a drone attack, not a domestic sabotage attack. All of these attacks in Crimea looked like there were some kind of drone attacks, and the Ukrainians were using, presumably, these Taiwanese drones. Now that still leaves a lot of unanswered questions which I certainly am not able to answer. How the Ukrainians were able to connect with these drones, presumably as these are military drones, even though they're fairly small. There is some way to do it, or the Ukrainians did find some way to do it, and to transmit messages, even though the distances are hundreds of kilometers from Ukrainian occupied territory. And this, of course, is also consistent with that article I saw in The Guardian about a week ago about a Ukrainian group operating against Russian forces in southern Ukraine, in Crimea as well, and in Kherson region, and doing so, carrying out strikes with drones. There's one point I would make, however, and that is that this drone offensive against Crimea seems, at least for the moment, to be in abeyance. Now, that may be because the Ukrainians have taken a step back and are thinking about how it worked and are busy refining their tactics, or it could be that the Russians have successfully developed countermeasures. And I remember that in one of in that Guardian article, there was an admission that working with these drones was actually quite difficult, and that the Russian electronic warfare systems, which were deployed against drones, were extremely sophisticated and were effective in cutting off communications to some of these drones. And of course, other drones, as we've seen, have been successfully shot down by Russia's Pantsir point defense gun missile system. So maybe this attack on Crimea was less successful than some might have expected. Maybe these drones disappointed. Maybe the success of the attack on Saki Air Base alerted the Russians to this danger from these drones, and they've developed effective countermeasures. And maybe this is the end of that offensive, or maybe, perhaps more plausibly, the Ukrainians are now taking stock of what happened, are now busy working out their own countermeasures to the Russian countermeasures, and we'll be seeing more of these drones operating again in future. Regardless, I just wanted to say that this is a good example of a member of the community who's carried out effective research. He was ahead of the curve on this story. He was absolutely right about the Taiwanese drones. As I said, it's been confirmed by the RT website. Apparently, it's open sources that this sale of these drones or supply of these drones from Taiwan has indeed happened. And we see and the Duran, what a formidable resource for us the community actually is. And I'd like to take an opportunity to thank this person for providing me with this information. I'm not going to disclose his name. As I've said previously, people who send me private emails, unless they are happy to have their names disclosed, can be certain that I won't disclose them. Now, on the topic of drone attacks, we come back to the subject of the HIMARS. Now, in a live stream, a wonderful live stream, by the way, that we did on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, with Brian Boletic of the New Atlas, I floated the point that it seemed to me as if HIMARS missile strikes have dwindled, that there doesn't seem to be as much HIMARS missile strikes now as we used to see. And there are reports, obviously, that the Russians have destroyed 8 launchers. There's even some reports, never confirmed, never fully confirmed, that they might have even obtained one through corrupt methods, who knows? In which case, Ukraine would be down to just 7. And there's also some reports that lots of HIMARS missiles, rockets, have been destroyed in warehouses. But one way or the other, well, we were hearing huge amounts about the HIMARS a short time ago, about attacks on positions, Russian positions behind the front lines. One hears a lot less of this now. There's the odd strike still against the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson region. and that seems to be about it. Now, there's apparently been a report which originates from a Ukrainian source, which appears to confirm that. Now, I have to be, again, very careful, but this report claims to be based on information from within the Ukrainian military. It says that more than 60% of the HIMARS have been destroyed. I presume that means launchers. It says that the Russians track the movement and placements of the HIMARS launch vehicles for a couple of days, worked out the way they were being used and were concealed, and were concealed after strikes. And then the Russians used that information that they'd gathered about the HIMARS to quickly destroy as many of them as they could, and that they seem to have destroyed supposedly 60% of them. By the way, 60% would equate to 8 allegedly destroyed and 1 supposedly acquired through corruption. But, you know, don't take that as confirmation. We don't know how secure this information actually is. The same source claims that the Russians were effective in locating the warehouses where the rockets and missiles used by these HIMARS were being stored, and they also developed their air defense tactics and technology to counter these HIMARS rockets. And it is indeed the case that the Russians have been increasingly reporting instances when their air defense claims to have succeeded in destroying HIMARS missiles which have been launched. And this source then goes on to say that the Ukrainian military now, instead of using the HIMARS in the way that they were being used previously, has decided to husband them, to hold them back in case they're needed in the event of a further developing crisis. Something which, if true, by the way, would reinforce the assessment of people like Brian Beletic that the United States has essentially given up in supplying more. Lastly, this person also says that the Ukrainian military assessed the attack on the Antonovsky Bridge as a failure. And supposedly, after a month and a half of constant attacks, the bridge is still standing. A lot of missiles have been expended, and this has been apparently a very costly affair, using up missiles that of which there is only a limited supply and which are expensive. And of course, several missile launchers, HIMARS launchers, have been identified and destroyed by the Russians in consequence. And the Russians have not lost their ability to transport and keep supplied their troops across the Dnieper, and that in summary this has all been a strategic failure. So attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge continue because it's again necessary to sustain morale. Well, I don't know how true that report is, and of course it's always dangerous to assume the truth of a report simply because it corroborates what you already believe. It's a trap lots of people fall into. They always believe evidence which appears to corroborate that which they think they already know. And in this case, as this supposed report corresponds with what I believe to be the case, with the HIMARS. I want to make out already clear in advance. Maybe this report is guessing, maybe it's speculating, but I've set it out in detail simply because, regardless of whether or not it really does originate with the Ukrainian source, which it may well do, by the way, it does correspond very closely to my own beliefs about the HIMARS systems and about what's happened with the Antonovsky Bridge. I think the Russians have got on top of the HIMARS. I think that they worked out how to counter them. I think that they have indeed worked out how the Ukrainians use them. I think they have indeed destroyed several of them, probably 8 of them. I think also that their air defenses are proving increasingly effective in countering these missiles. I think that Ukraine probably is struggling with limited supplies of these missiles. And I think that these constant attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge, which still stands, were in the end a strategic failure, absorbing ammunition for the HIMARS, which might have been more effectively used in other ways. So I want to make it clear, this is my belief. It's interesting to see a document circulating which appears to corroborate it. My belief was my assessment of this had been reached before the appearance of this document. I don't place a huge amount of credence in it, but for what it's worth, it's interesting that someone, whether on the Ukrainian side or perhaps the Russian, if this is actually a Russian concocted document, has come to the same view as me. Anyway, to move on, we also have further developments about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Now, yesterday, we were all being told that the power plant had been completely disconnected from the Ukrainian energy grid, electricity grid, depriving Ukraine of around 20% of its power, of its electric power. Then we got reports that one of the units at the power plant had gone back on stream and had been reconnected, and that the power plant had been reconnected to the Ukrainian electricity grid. And then we got what I suspect is the further correction, and I suspect this is the actual correction, that the part of the power plant which is still operating is providing electricity and electric power to those parts of the Ukrainian electricity grid which cover territory under Russian control. In other words, Kherson, Zaporozhye region, parts of Donbass. Well, who knows which is true? What is indisputably true is that there's been major efforts on the part of various parties to try and get some kind of inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and that there are reports that the inspectors will finally arrive at the nuclear power plant next week. And it's also the case that apparently this morning, on the day that I'm making this video, shelling of the power plant by, well, I have to say, it only makes sense to me, by Ukraine, apparently has intensified. Could it be that that's an attempt to prevent inspection of the power plant by the International Atomic Energy Agency? We're also getting news that the Russians are now carrying out fairly aggressive counter-battery work against the artillery forces that have been used to strike at this power plant. We'll see what happens. But as an example of how disruptive this conflict is becoming, consider what happened at the United Nations. There was a statement which was agreed by all states, all United Nations member states, reaffirming commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and its regime, which is supposed to restrict or prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And then someone, it's not difficult to guess who, decided before this statement was published to insert into the statement a clause about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which could be interpreted as requiring the return of this power plant to Ukrainian control. Now, whoever did that was presumably hoping to achieve either one of two things. Either they were hoping that the Russians, who support the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, would not notice that this paragraph had been inserted, or would be too embarrassed to object to it and would sign off on this statement, in which case, of course, there would be intense pressure on the Russians to fulfill the terms of this statement by handing over the nuclear power plant back to Ukraine. Or alternatively, the Russians would refuse to sign off on this statement, which is in fact what they did. And that would supposedly embarrass the Russians. Well, the Russians did, as I said, refuse to sign off on this statement, with the result that the statement hasn't been approved. Now, perhaps the Russians are marginally embarrassed about this, but I have to say that for me, whoever did this, whatever clever person was responsible for this, was again playing fast and loose with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, trying to insert paragraphs into statements about nuclear non-proliferation, about the unrelated issue of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, in order to achieve what exactly? Embarrass the Russians? Compromise the whole principle of nuclear non-proliferation by subverting a statement for that purpose? Perhaps some people in the West are congratulating themselves with having embarrassed the Russians over this. To me, it looks like a rather silly schoolboy prank, I have to say that, and I think that most of the world is going to be deeply unimpressed. That's my own view. Others may disagree. For the rest, in the West, we are now facing increasingly grim economic news. And I speak from Britain, from London, where there's actually something, in my opinion, of a whiff of panic about, because we've now received confirmation that in October, fuel prices are going to rise by 80%. This was on top of a 50+% increase in April. I presume the 80% increase is a compound increase, taking into account that 50% increase in April. And there is now widespread acceptance in Britain that this is going to put unbearable pressure on middle class and working class families. And there's demands that the government do something to palliate this problem, though it's completely unclear what they can do. They can't conjure up more energy supply. And of course, there's talk about providing more money to help people through these problems, except of course that if they do that, it's at a time when the British government finances are already in severe deficit. The only way this can be done is either through more borrowing, which would be expensive, given that mortgage interest rates are rising, or conceivably through more money printing, which would mean a reverse of the withdrawal from QE, which would be inconsistent, by the way, with the interest rate rises, and which might, by the way, have further inflationary effects. Moreover, I'm going to make a suggestion which is that not only are we going to see increasing shortages of gas, which is what is driving this particular fuel increase, we're going to start to see further rises in petrol prices, in oil prices again very soon. Oil prices have again been rising over the last couple of days, but I suspect they're going to rise even more. Firstly, it seems to me that the Biden administration's constant release of oil from the United States' strategic oil reserve is now reaching the limit of what can be done. Apparently, those oil reserves are now falling to dangerously low levels, not seen since the middle of the 1980s. And I suspect that there will be warnings given by security officials to the Biden administration that this cannot be sustained for much longer. I don't know how important the release of oil from the strategic reserve has been in putting downward pressure on prices. But anyway, that is probably coming to an end and will probably come to an end soon, perhaps after the midterms in November. But then there's two other things which point, to my mind, to the likelihood of rises in oil prices. One is that the Chinese government appears to be working towards reflating the Chinese economy in an effort to increase growth rates. And it's difficult to see how that can happen without putting upward pressure on oil prices. Obviously, China is buying a lot of oil from Russia at a discounted price, and President Xi Jinping is due soon, apparently, to visit Saudi Arabia, and he will no doubt be talking with the Saudis about also obtaining oil from Saudi Arabia, also at some kind of capped price. But regardless of that, more oil for China is going to mean less oil for everyone else at precisely the point when, as I said, the United States is probably going to have to stop releasing oil from its strategic reserve. But there's a third thing that's also happening, which is that the Saudis have been saying for some time that their production is actually maxed out. They don't have leeway to increase production further from current levels. And they're now starting to talk about actually cutting production. Now, the Saudi oil minister suggested that this might be linked to moves by the United States to lift sanctions on oil from Iran, oil exports from Iran, as part of a new nuclear deal between the United States and Iran. I'm a little skeptical about this for one very straightforward reason. It seems to me that even if those sanctions on Iranian oil exports are lifted, I doubt that it's going to result in any huge increase in supply of oil from Iran. Firstly, the Iranian oil industry would need a long time to crank back up to the level where it could seriously increase production and export of oil. It could be done, but it will take time. Secondly, this talk about Iran re-entering the oil market ignores the fact that Iran in reality has never left it. There is quite a lot of oil already being exported by Iran. I doubt that the Iranians who found a way to circumvent US sanctions have much oil to spare over and beyond the oil that they are already exporting. By the way, the same has been true about Venezuela. There was again a lot of discussion and talk about Venezuela cranking up its oil production, its oil exports, in light of what appeared to be a softening of US sanctions on Venezuela. But the great increase in Venezuelan oil exports that many expected has failed to materialize. Because again, the state of Venezuela's oil industry simply makes that impossible, at least in the short term. There would need to be sustained investment in both the Iranian and Venezuelan oil industries before they could start to increase exports more. So I doubt, frankly, that this is really what is driving the Saudis. Now, the Saudis have confirmed that they are still keen to maintain their oil alliance with Russia. And I'm sure this is true. And now, especially that both Saudi Arabia and Russia are supplying oil to China, the Saudis and the Russians will be keen to ensure that the Chinese don't play them off against each other. China and Russia may be friends. Saudi Arabia and China may be friends. But after all, this is a competitive commercial environment, and everybody will want to keep on good terms with each other by making sure that nobody takes advantage of the other party. So the Saudis do want to keep their relationship with Russia on an even keel. And besides, I think that the Saudis do not want, for various reasons, to be seen as aligning too closely with the United States against Russia at this time. This is a complicated topic. I'm going to discuss it further in a future program. But I think the reason why the Saudis may be thinking about cutting production is not because they're worried about the Iranian and a deal between Iran and the United States and a flood of Iranian oil appearing on the market. I don't think it is because the Saudis are too concerned about maintaining their relationship with Moscow. I suspect it's because they have to. Anybody who has had any knowledge about how oil production is undertaken knows that it is actually a bad idea to keep producing oil at maximum levels from oil wells. It can actually do damage to the oil wells. And I suspect that the Saudis are probably saying to themselves that with prices high, they can actually afford to reduce production because it's not going to affect their income significantly. And that they're doing this more for technical reasons, for industry reasons, than for geopolitical ones. So we could be seeing falls in Saudi oil production, reductions in US releases of oil from their strategic reserves, and an increase in Chinese demand, all coming at about the same time. I think this is highly plausible. All the facts seem to point in that direction. Now, the United States is relatively self-sufficient in terms of oil, though I have to say, if oil prices generically rise, that will affect the United States. But of course, Europe is not, and a further increase in oil prices, especially at a time when the Europeans have taken it upon themselves to sanction imports of Russian shipborne oil, that's going to cause major problems in Europe. And there's another factor that might be causing more problems in Europe too, and that is that there's now growing information, growing suggestions that supply of liquefied natural gas to Europe from the United States is going to start falling over the next few months. The United States has been exporting LNG heavily to Europe over the last few months to try to balance out the fall in the import by the European Union of Russian gas. But doing so means that LNG has been diverted from the United States. The United States' own reserves of natural gas are therefore low, and that is leading to potential spikes of LNG, of gas prices, natural gas prices in the United States itself, with the administration very sensitive to energy costs in the United States and the political effect there is from that. One can see the logic of reducing exports of LNG to Europe. And apparently there's actually now pressure on the industry from the US administration for it to do just that. On top of all of this, other countries, Qatar for example, which the Vice-Chancellor, the German Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck, ridiculously claimed in March, had agreed to supply LNG in vast quantities to Germany. Well, those LNG supplies from Qatar are not materializing, and Canada apparently has also said that it is not in a position to increase LNG supplies to Europe. So it could be that the European energy crunch is going to get very much worse, in which case we're going to start to see even further increases in energy prices in Europe over the next few months, over and above those that are going to hit in the autumn. And when I talk about Europe, I'm talking about Britain as well. Now, disastrously, there doesn't seem to be a plan about what to do about this. The European Union called an urgent summit meeting to discuss what to do in the face of Putin's weaponization of energy. Well, all I will say is that this is an energy war which Europe itself initiated. It was they who decided that they were going to reduce dependence on Russian gas. It was they who decided to impose sanctions on imports of shipborne Russian oil. Perhaps they didn't think it through. Perhaps they're praying for a warm winter. We shall see. But I suspect that concerns about this situation are now spreading in Europe within the chancelleries and governments, even though all of them are now so committed to this course of economic confrontation and economic war with Russia that it's difficult to see how they can turn back. Meanwhile, prices of pretty much everything in Russia continue to fall. Shops apparently are full. I'm getting lots of reports from Russians confirming as much, people in Russia confirming as much. And of course, given that the country is a major energy producer, it's unlikely many people, or perhaps anyone, will be cold this winter. I'm not going to say more. I think the facts speak for themselves. There's still time before the autumn to pull some rabbits out of the hat. Perhaps the Europeans will find them. I don't know where they are, but, necessity is sometimes the mother of invention. We'll see. But at the moment, all I will say is the omens don't look good. That's my summary of events for today. There'll be more from me soon. remember, you can find me, you can find all our Duran and Alex Christoforou videos on other platforms, on Locals first and foremost, on Rumble, on ODYSEE, on Telegram, and on BitChute. And you can support us, support our work if you like our work, via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also don't forget that you can go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.